The Bible is not flattering in how it portrays its heroes, and Abram's treatment of his slave girl Hagar is probably one of the worst examples in the whole book. Hi, my name is Pete, and in 2024 I'm reading the whole Bible in its original languages, Hebrew, Aramaic and Greek. I'm using a reading plan that I wrote myself, which is available in an ebook I've released for free. Today I read Genesis chapter 16. In 2022, Adrienne T. Aiken-Morgan from Campbell University Divinity School published a paper on this chapter and how it is layered with meaning given the social status of women in ancient Near Eastern society. I'm going to step through her explanation of the chapter bit by bit, and then I'm going to give you a little review of what I think the strengths and weaknesses of the paper are. Aiken-Morgan opens with a discussion of women in the ancient Near East, how those who had children had high status, but those who had no children had low status. And therefore, for this reason, surrogate motherhood using female servants was a societal norm for those who were unable to bear themselves. Slavery was also a societal norm. That's where people had the status of property. And so a wealthy woman was able to take a slave woman and use her as a surrogate mother to bear children for herself. She moves on to discuss the sources of Genesis 16 and says that it is a Yahwistic or at least a non-P text. But some scholars contend that verses 3 and 15 to 16 and some also verse 1 are actually from the P source. Between stories that describe God's covenant with Abram, there are similarities between Genesis chapter 15 and 17. Abram asks for Ishmael to be his heir in Genesis 17, and while this request is rejected, he will become the father of a separate nation to fulfill the promise to Hagar in this chapter. Women are the key players throughout Genesis 16. Sarai is driven by her barrenness. Only choice that she has is to either pray to Yahweh or use a surrogate. The Yahwistic author's purpose is to show that God can be trusted. Hagar is Egyptian and may be one of the slaves given to Abram by Pharaoh in Genesis chapter 12. Aiken-Morgan discusses the word shifcha, which is used to refer to Hagar. It could mean slave girl, and some scholars have connected it with the cognate verb pouring out or shedding blood in Hebrew, and also with the word amah or concubine. But others have connected it to the Ugaritic verb sfch, meaning being together, and also to the Hebrew word mispacha, meaning clan. So the idea is of someone attached to a clan. Hagar now, after having the child, has a higher status. The Lipit Ishtar Code states that the children of a father's first and second wife will divide his property equally. And Aiken-Morgan sees that perhaps as an indication of why it is that Hagar now has higher status in the household. Sarai blames Abram for what has happened and for the fact that Hagar now is looking down upon her. But Abram reminds Sarai about her power, and so Sarai uses that power to mistreat Hagar, which is the same word used of the Israelites being mistreated in Egypt. And when Hagar flees from Sarai, that is the same word that is used of the Israelites leaving Egypt. So Hagar flees the house, and the Lord's angel meets her near Shur, which is on the way to Egypt. And so possibly Hagar may have been returning home to Egypt in light of what's happened. The Lord commands her to return to the home of Abram and Sarai, but this happens in the context of the promise that he gives her. And so she takes on a surrogate patriarch role because of the similarity of what he says to her and what he'd said to Abram in Genesis chapter 15. It's very significant here how things are portrayed positively toward Hagar. The name Ishmael means God hears, and Hagar is the first woman in the Bible to receive an annunciation of a son. The annunciations of sons in the Gospel of Luke parallel this announcement to Hagar. The prophecy about Ishmael is positive, even though that's hard to recognize for modern ears. What sounds like a negative statement, the wild ass of a man, actually is simply a statement meaning he will be free. And Aiken-Morgan has a really helpful phrase saying you should think of a phrase like a wild stallion, someone who's not confined by anything. So Ishmael will be a free man, not a slave like his mother Hagar. That's what the promise to her is. The Hebrew preposition bait should not be translated against here, but with. And Hagar is the only person in the Bible to actually give God a name. The name that she gives him is El Roi, God who sees. Calling God El, which is a general term for God in ancient Near Eastern times, but the narrator calls God by the divine name, Yahweh, which shows that the God who saved her is the same God who saved the Israelites from Egypt. Hagar says something then about seeing God, and various translations of her words have been suggested. Truly here I have seen him who looks after me. I have now seen the one who sees me. Have I also thus far seen after one seeing me? Have I not gone on seeing after being seen by God? And various scholars, though, favour an emendation of the text, which reflects the NRSV's translation. Have I really seen God and remained alive after seeing him? But the text without the emendation, just Hagar's statement on its own, is ironic, given the Israelite tradition that a person cannot see God's face and live. The well becomes named Be'er Lachai Ro'i, which means well of the living one who sees me. This meaning reflects the name that Hagar had given God, which suggests that Hagar is the one who named the well. Normally, doing such a thing would be a male activity. Hagar then returns to Abram and Sarai, and Abram names the child Ishmael, suggesting that he had heard and believed Hagar's account of her encounter with the Lord. Sarai's absence at the end of this story at this point suggests that she did not get a child through Hagar. Ironically, the child that Hagar got belongs to her, doesn't belong to Sarai at all. It's Abram's and Hagar's child. Chapter 17 suggests that Abram himself possibly even believed that Ishmael was the promised seed. The key message of the text is that the Lord sees those who are unseen and sides with the oppressed poor in their just position against those who are oppressors. So I want to make 4 critiques about Aiken-Morgan's paper, and I want to praise it for something at the end. So first, on page 391, Aiken-Morgan summarises various positions on the sources of Genesis chapter 16. But her description of these positions in the secondary literature lack any real evaluation. She only quotes one actual piece of evidence used to justify anything, that the phrase "in the land of Canaan" is also found in the J source, not just the E and P sources. All Aiken-Morgan has done here, though, is compile a list of views articulated in the secondary literature with little or no substantive evaluation of those views. She makes similar lists for the meaning of shifcha on pages 392 and 393, and for translations of the second half of verse 13 on page 395. Now, just listing views and suggesting where your preference lies in them is not really an exposition, and I don't really like that form of argumentation very much. Second, Aiken-Morgan claims on page 391 that the essay will show that the division of sources supposedly has important theological implications. But the entire discussion of sources then never re-emerges in the article. I think the review committee should have picked her up on this to correct that claim before it went to print. In truth, whether chapter 16 is entirely egoistic, has multiple interpolations from the P source, or the entire idea of the documentary hypothesis is all fictional, has no bearing whatsoever on Aiken-Morgan's argument or conclusions in this paper. Third, for a paper that makes many intertextual connections between Genesis 16 and other parts of the Bible, both Old and New Testaments, it was frustrating that Aiken-Morgan never addressed the very clear textual allusions to Genesis chapter 3. In Genesis 2 to 3, a husband is given a word from God, which the wife comes to doubt, which then leads to sin because the husband takes a subservient role. In Genesis 15 and 16, a husband is given a word from God, which the wife comes to doubt, which leads to sin because the husband takes a subservient role. Aiken-Morgan explicitly mentions this subservience of Abram on page 391, but never makes this connection with Genesis 3. The connection is strengthened by what appears to be a direct allusion in verse 2 to God's rebuke of Adam in Genesis chapter 3 verse 17. Here's Genesis chapter 3 verse 17. Ki shamata lekol ishtecha. Because you listened to the voice of your wife. And here's Genesis 16 verse 2. Vayishma Avram lekol Sarai. And Abram listened to the voice of Sarah. Furthermore, Hagar's name, Hagar, even sounds like the Hebrew for the word the garden, Hagan. And maybe there's nothing to that, but it just sounds to me as though there's some deliberate connections being made between those two chapters. I argued in another video that beautiful women being a temptation for God's people and drawing them away is an echo of the sin in Genesis 3 has already been a theme in the book of Genesis. The link for that video is in the description below. The point is, Genesis 16 is clearly supposed to be Abram's fall from grace. His lack of trust in God, leading to his mistreatment of women to protect himself, was a theme already established by the Egypt incident in Genesis 12. But the R word of Hagar was in many respects Abram's eating the forbidden fruit moment. This is the ultimate sin he could have performed, the worst possible thing that he could do. This is his fall from grace. The final problem I have with Aiken-Morgan's paper is also an intertextual connection that she failed to discuss, and that's the direct exposition of this passage by Paul in the book of Galatians. Paul's use of Genesis 16 is a highly debated point, and his apparent negative view of Hagar seems to shockingly contradict the positive view that Aiken-Morgan strongly argues for. A full exegesis of Galatians would of course be outside the scope of Aiken-Morgan's paper, but given that she references Luke's Gospel as an example of positive allusions to Hagar in the New Testament, the lack of any discussion or reference to Galatians at all is notably absent. Now, despite these gripes, I really like Aiken-Morgan's paper, and what I really like about it is her detailed and careful exposition of how Hagar is positively portrayed in Genesis 16. This is such a carefully written chapter, okay, to show us how Sarai and Abram really failed this young woman, and how she actually was honoured by the Lord who came to meet her. So Aiken-Morgan's explanation of God's prophecy of Ishmael as a positive statement that merely sounds negative to modern ears is really persuasive, and it's effectively argued. Genesis 16 is a text that challenges us to reflect carefully on how our sin affects those in positions of weakness under us. Sarai and Abram's lack of trust may have looked socially acceptable in their context, but the God of the Bible did not see things the way that they did. Instead, he stood with Hagar. Now, this year, as I read the Bible in its original languages, I will read, summarise and critique other journal articles about the biblical text. So if you want to read the rest of the Bible with me in 2024 in the original languages, then details on my Bible reading plan and EPUB reader, which is free to download and use, can be found in the description below. And if you like the video, please like the video. And if you want to get video updates of my whole Bible read through in the original languages in 2024, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Thanks for watching.